Vocab time! Let's talk about seam allowance. So seam allowance is going to be visually represented on a pattern as a thin, narrow border that goes around the exterior of the pattern piece in any area where that pattern piece is going to be joined with another pattern piece. The purpose of seam allowance is to allow for the joining of two pieces of fabric without altering the dimensions of your garment itself. So this is specifically relevant with non-stretch or minimal stretch fabrics. Imagine if you've made a fitted bodice completely to your size, but you don't include seam allowance in your pattern piece. Well, when you join your two pieces, your front and back bodice together, no matter what, some material is going to be lost to the mechanism of sewing them together. So at the end of your garment construction, your finished piece is going to be, to some degree, smaller than what you wanted it to be. With knit fabric, it's a little bit easier because the stretch of the fabric makes up for seam allowance. So specifically with fitted knit or stretch garments like yoga pants or leggings or fitted t-shirts, you're not going to want to add seam allowance because by adding that extra material, in addition to the natural stretch of the fabric, you'll create bagginess and bulges that go against the aesthetic of that type of garment. And the last thing to know is that in the case of a store-bought pattern, it will say what kind of seam allowance it wants you to use. It'll tell you, first of all, whether the pattern has a seam allowance included, and if so, how much it is. That means that you don't have to add any, you just sew with the seam allowance that it indicates, or it'll tell you if you need to add an additional amount of seam allowance, and if so, the recommended amount that they tell you to add. The most common two are going to be 3/8 of an inch and 1/2 inch. So hopefully this helps just a little bit.